Welcome to Through the Bible with Pastor Michael, a podcast from First Baptist Church in Mustang, Oklahoma. Here's Pastor Michael.
All right, we continue our reading through First Kings, and we are just about completed with it. We will finish First Kings tomorrow. So this is our next to last day in the book of First Kings. We're covering chapters 16, 17, 18, and 19. 5 observations. Number 1, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, and Ahab serve as kings in Israel, and all are wicked. It tells us in chapter 16 about these kings and how they were more wicked than the ones before them. We're going to talk about our application about how, unless someone repents and seeks the Lord, that's what sin does. It just keeps getting passed down and made even worse. And we certainly see that in the reading today as these kings seem to be trying to outdo each other in wickedness and rebellion. Number 2, Elijah tells King Ahab of a coming drought. That becomes important because that's going to set up this amazing reality that the Lord controls the weather, and that the Lord can respond to the prayers of his people and show himself in power right in the midst of even a drought. A third observation is that after being helped by a widow at Zarephath, Elijah prays for her son who died, and God revives him. Really an amazing thing in chapter 17, there in verses 17 to 24. And the result of Elijah, who prayed 3 times for that son, in verse 24, the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." And so the Lord in his kindness allowed Elijah to be ministered to by the lady, and then he prayed for the son, and the Lord was gracious and brought life back to the son. A fourth observation, Elijah challenges and defeats the prophets of Baal. Chapter 18, a very well-known story of Elijah as he gathers against the prophets of Baal, and they are each to prepare a sacrifice. The prophets of Baal call on their false gods to answer. Of course, there is no response there. And then Elijah actually pours water out over the sacrifice to make it even harder, humanly speaking, for a sacrifice to be burnt up and consumed. Of course, that is no problem for the Lord. And so the Lord answers and responds, and Elijah then defeats the prophets of Baal. A fifth observation is that Elijah prays for rain, and God answers his prayer. He flees from Jezebel and then calls Elisha to succeed him. So quite a few things happening here at the end of our reading today. A few things by way of application. Number 1, God teaches us through his word the importance of not repeating the sins of people before us. And so our first application is that sin leads to more sin unless you turn to God. What happens in a culture, in a society, in a family, are people who are sinful and rebellious. They pass that down. They pass it down by what they say. They pass it down by what they do. They pass it down by what they fail to do. And people learn these wicked ways. And sometimes it's formally taught. It's purposefully taught. Other times, wickedness and disobedience is just kind of observed and then practiced. It's just observed, and then it just kind of becomes part of what that family or that culture does. And unless somebody repents and seeks the Lord and turns from their wicked ways, we just see sin being exacerbated the more and more and more that it gets passed down. Second application, God can use anything and anyone to accomplish his will. We see that in chapter 17 as Elijah is fed here by the ravens, and then the widow takes care of him. She was down to her last meal. She was going to prepare a meal for her son and then expect to die. Elijah says, why don't you use that flour, use that oil to feed me? She does, and then the Lord provides in chapter 17, verse 16, the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. And so the Lord can use anyone, and he can use anything to accomplish his will. The third application is that believers are often falsely accused, and we have to know that. Chapter 18, we see that as Ahab, in verse 17, Ahab saw Elijah, and Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And so Elijah, the prophet of God, who's doing what the Lord's called him to do, he's the one accused of being the troubler. And that happens. The people of God are often falsely accused. Oftentimes the culture would say, if not for the preacher, or if not for the Christian, if not for the church, things would be so much better. In reality, we're the restraint. We are the ones that are, in God's grace, holding back the full measure of the wrath of God poured out upon the wickedness of a people. The church is the one doing the good work of being the hands and feet of Christ. But for those who don't believe, they may look at the church or the preacher or the believer and say, our culture would be so much better off without you. You're just a troubler. Your doctrine, your beliefs, your message, your gospel, it's just troubling. Well, that's exactly what happens in Elijah's life, as Ahab says, "You're the troubler." And then in verse 18, he said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." Now, Ahab says, "You're the problem here, Elijah. You're the trouble of the people." And Elijah says, "You got it backwards. I'm not the problem. I'm not the troubler. I'm the one speaking the words of God. You're the one that has turned your back on the Lord, forsaken his word, and have pursued false gods." So believers just know we're going to be falsely accused, and we just have to know that. And doesn't mean we have to like it. We don't have to be okay with it in the sense of it's not a problem. It just means that we don't get silenced by it. We don't get overly discouraged by it. We keep speaking the truth. A fourth application, God answers the prayers of his people. I know that sounds so elementary, and there's been times this year where we've highlighted that, and it seems so basic, but I think it's important for us to be reminded of this truth, that God does hear the prayers of his people. I think sometimes praying becomes hard because we wonder, is God really hearing this? And if he hears it, is God really going to move on behalf of this? And I think it's such an encouragement when we read, like we did in the reading today, of how God heard and answered and responded to the prayers of his people. So pray with fervency, pray with expectation, pray for sure in accordance with God's will and for his glory to be made known. But pray expecting God to move on your behalf. And then a fifth and final application, be encouraged because God always has a remnant. God always has a remnant. Chapter 19, verse 18, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Even though it seems like everyone has pursued the false gods, even though it seems like everyone has turned their back on the Lord reminds the prophet here that he has a remnant. And that's true in our day as well. The world seems dark. The news seems dark. Even so-called churches in our culture are just anything other than places of exalting Jesus Christ, so many of them. But the Lord still has his remnant. The Lord always has his remnant. So wherever you live, whatever you're doing, be encouraged to know the Lord has always had his remnant. He will always have his remnant. In Noah's day, the remnant was small, but he had his remnant. In the days here of Elijah, The remnant is small, but they're still a remnant. They're still the people of God. And so take heart. You're not alone. The Lord always has his remnant. And then just a very brief summary from a short Psalm 82. We turn to God to help those in need. We turn to God, asking him to help those who are in need. All right? So that's a quick run through 1 Kings 16, 17, 18, and 19. Tomorrow, we will finish the book of 1 Kings and yet again have another entire book of the Bible that we have completed and that we have finished. And we're going to do that again because tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we'll read the entire book of Jonah and knock that out in a day. And the next day, read the very short New Testament book of Philemon. And so here in just 3 days, we're going to finish 1 Kings, Jonah, and Philemon as we make our march toward the halfway point of the year in reading through the entirety of God's Word. All right? Hope you're blessed today as you study and read.